Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Paranoid Stories. Today I am back with 10 true Pacific Northwest horror stories. These narratives have been carefully crafted, drawing from the terrifying experiences of park rangers, long-haul drivers, seasoned hikers, and those who claim to have witnessed impossible anomalies that defy the laws of nature and light in the deep woods, rugged coastlines, and desolate mountain passes of the PNW. To protect the privacy of those involved, names and specific locations have been carefully altered while preserving the terrifying authenticity of each encounter, where shadows stand still, colors fade, and the landscape itself seems to be watching. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Paranoid Stories for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what lurks in the shadows. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when darkness descends upon our channel. Now let us begin our journey into the heart of wilderness terror. It was October 19th, about 11:30 at night. I was doing a routine patrol of the Sunrise Trailhead parking lot. We'd had issues with people camping illegally, leaving trash, that sort of thing. The lot was empty except for my truck. Rain had been coming down hard all evening, turning the trail access into this slick mess of mud and fallen needles. I was about to head back when my flashlight caught something on the ground near the trailhead marker, a dollar bill, folded into a perfect square, maybe an inch across. The weird part, and I mean immediately weird, was that it was completely dry. Pristine. Like someone had just placed it there seconds ago, even though the mud around it was getting hammered by rain. I picked it up. The paper was crisp, still had that new money stiffness. I unfolded it carefully, and that's when my stomach dropped. The serial number wasn't random. It was a date, 0417-2001, April 17th, 2001, my birthday. I stood there in the rain, staring at this thing. The odds of that, I'm not a mathematician, but that felt impossible. I told myself it had to be coincidence, but my hands were already shaking, and I couldn't explain why. Something about finding it there, bone dry in a downpour, folded with such precise corners. I should have left. I know that now. But I kept thinking there had to be a rational explanation, so I swept my flashlight across the trail entrance. About 15 feet in, there was another one. Same perfect fold. Same impossible dryness. This one's serial number was 11232019, November 23rd, 2019, the day my mother died. I actually said "what the hell" out loud. My voice sounded strange in the rain, too small. Nobody knew I was out there. Cell service was non-existent. The nearest ranger station was 40 minutes down the mountain. I picked up the second bill, and my fingers had gone numb. Not from cold, from something else. The bills were laid out like breadcrumbs. I could see a third one about 20 feet further up the trail, just barely visible in my flashlight beam. Every logical part of my brain was screaming to get back in the truck, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know what this was. The third bill's number was a vehicle identification sequence, JM3TB28A. The exact VIN of my first car, a Mazda 3 I'd bought, used in high school. My dad had made me memorize it for insurance purposes. I'd never told anyone that number, never posted it online. It wasn't something you could just look up. That's when the cold started, not weather cold. This was different, like the air pressure had changed. The rain was still coming down, but it felt muted somehow, hitting the ground without much sound. I turned around to look back at the parking lot, and I couldn't see my truck anymore. The darkness between the trees had gotten thicker. There was a fourth bill ahead, then a fifth. They were leading me deeper into the forest, and I was following them. I don't know why. It felt like I didn't have a choice, like some part of me had to see where this ended. The fourth serial number was my social security number, all 9 digits, split across the bill's code. The fifth was my childhood home's street address, just the numbers, no letters, but I knew exactly what it meant. 2847. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't broadcasting this information. I'm careful online. I don't overshare. These weren't things anyone could scrape from a database or guess randomly. Someone, something, had access to the most specific, buried details of my life, and they were arranging them in sequence on dollar bills in the middle of a deserted trail, in the rain. By the 6th bill, I'd stopped walking normally. I was moving in short bursts, sweeping my light around constantly because I'd started to feel watched. Not like someone was following me, like someone was ahead of me, laying these out in real time, waiting for me to catch up. The 6th serial number was a phone number I'd never given to anyone. A crisis hotline I'd called exactly once in college during a bad semester. I'd used it from a payphone, paid anonymously. That number shouldn't exist anywhere connected to my name. The 7th bill was waiting at a fork in the trail. I stopped there for a full minute, trying to force myself to turn around. The fold was so exact it looked machine-made, but I could see faint impressions in the paper, like fingers had pressed it. Human fingers. The serial number was my blood type and my driver's license number, combined. B7A2K. I picked it up, and that's when I heard the sound. Not from the trail ahead, from behind me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, matching my pace exactly, but offset by a few seconds. Like someone had been following me the entire time, stepping exactly where I'd stepped. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the rain. Nothing. Just trees and darkness and that thick, wrong silence. But I could feel it. The presence. It wasn't hiding. It wanted me to know it was there. The 8th bill was 10 feet away, just past a massive Douglas fir. I moved toward it, and my boot hit something that wasn't mud. Something metallic. I looked down and saw a pile of coins scattered in the dirt, all face up, all minted in 2001. My birth year, dozens of them arranged in a spiral. When I picked up the 8th bill, I couldn't read the serial number at first. My hands were shaking too badly. When I finally steadied the flashlight, I saw it wasn't a date or a code. It was a sequence of numbers I'd never seen before. 11052025. November 5th, 2025. Tomorrow's date. That's when I ran. I didn't follow the trail. I just crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my jacket, my boots slipping on wet roots. I could hear those footsteps behind me, faster now, closing the distance. Not running, just walking, quick and efficient, like something that knew I couldn't escape. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't remember getting to the parking lot. One second I was in the trees, the next I was in my truck with the doors locked, engines screaming, mud spraying everywhere as I tore out of there. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. I quit the next morning, didn't go back for my gear, told my supervisor I had a family emergency and couldn't finish the season. He didn't ask questions. Here's the part I can't stop thinking about. When I got home that night, I emptied my pockets. I'd shoved all 8 bills into my jacket without thinking, but when I counted them, there were 9. The last one wasn't folded. It was crisp and flat, like it had just come from a bank. The serial number was my current address, the apartment I'm sitting in right now. I'm a nature photographer. That's my whole thing. Patience, waiting, catching moments most people miss. I'm telling you this because what happened to me in the Columbia River Gorge last September Doesn't fit with someone who spends their life observing details. I see things. It's literally my job. I'd driven out to this remote spot about 15 miles off the main highway, chasing rumors of a spotted owl sighting. Not the most glamorous subject, but rare enough to be worth the 4-hour wait in a blind I'd set up the day before. The location was perfect. Elevated ridge, clear sight lines across a small valley, thick forest all around. The kind of place where you hear nothing but wind and your own breathing. I got there around 7 in the morning, set up my camera, checked my lenses, settled in. The blind was basically a camo tent with a small opening for my lens. Cramped, but I'd been in worse. From my position, I could see most of the valley below, and directly across from me, maybe 200 yards out, there was this rock formation. Not huge, maybe 12 feet tall, weirdly shaped like someone had stacked 3 boulders on top of each other at odd angles. The morning sun hit it from the east, and it cast a long shadow across the grass, probably 20 feet of darkness stretching west. I barely noticed it at first, just part of the landscape. Around 9, I was checking my watch, calculating how much longer until the light would be right. That's when I looked at the rock formation again. The shadow was still there, same position, 20 feet pointing west. I remember thinking that was odd because the sun had moved. I could see it, higher now, the light hitting my blind from a different angle. My own shadow had shifted at least 30 degrees. But that shadow across the valley, exactly the same. I told myself I was wrong about the time. Maybe I'd only been there an hour, not 2. But my watch said 9:15, and I'd logged my arrival time in my phone. I pulled it out, checked. 7:02 in the morning, arrival, no mistake. I kept watching. Took a few photos of the rock formation just to document it. The shadow showed up perfectly in the images, crisp, dark, stretching across the grass. Nothing unusual about it except that it wouldn't move. By 10:30, the sun was almost directly overhead. The angle was completely wrong for that shadow. My own shadow had compressed to almost nothing beneath me. The trees around me cast these short, stubby shadows. Everything was responding to the light the way it should, except that shadow. Still 20 feet long, still pointing west. I couldn't focus on the birds anymore. I kept staring at it, trying to work out some logical explanation. Maybe the rock had some weird reflective property. Maybe there was another light source I wasn't seeing. Except there wasn't. The sky was clear, no clouds, no aircraft, nothing. Around 11, I stepped out of the blind. My legs were stiff from sitting so long, and I needed to walk, needed to do something other than stare at that impossible shadow. I paced along the ridge for a few minutes, keeping the rock formation in view the whole time. The shadow didn't flicker, didn't shift, didn't respond to me moving, to the sun climbing higher, to anything. Here's the thing. I wasn't scared yet. I was confused, maybe a little unsettled, but my brain kept trying to rationalize it. Optical illusion, trick of the terrain, something I was missing. I decided to get closer. The hike down into the valley took about 20 minutes. The ground was uneven, lots of loose rocks and scrub brush. I kept my eyes on the rock formation the whole way, and the closer I got, the more wrong it felt. Not the rocks themselves, those looked normal enough. But the shadow, it had this quality to it that I can't quite describe. Too dark, maybe. Too solid. When I was about 50 feet away, I stopped. The shadow was right in front of me now, this long stripe of darkness cutting across the grass. I could see individual blades of grass inside it, but they looked dull, muted, like the shadow was heavier than it should be. I crouched down and reached out. I don't know why. Curiosity, I guess. The need to prove to myself it was just a shadow. My hand passed into it, and the cold hit me immediately. Not like stepping into shade on a hot day. This was deeper, sharper, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. And there was resistance. Not much, but enough that I noticed, like pushing my hand through very thick air. I pulled back fast, stood up. The cold stayed with me for a few seconds, clinging to my fingers. That's when I realized the shadow had texture. I could see it now that I was close. It wasn't flat against the ground. It rose up slightly, maybe an inch or two, this column of pure darkness hovering just above the grass. When I moved my head, trying to see it from different angles, it didn't change. It stayed opaque, solid-looking. I walked around it, circled the entire thing. The rock formation itself cast no other shadow. Just this one, this impossible stripe of darkness that didn't obey any rules I understood. I reached out again, slower this time, pressed my palm flat against the surface of the shadow. It felt like cold glass, smooth, hard. My hand couldn't pass through it. I was touching something even though my eyes told me it was just darkness. I pushed harder, and the resistance increased. It was solid, completely solid. My breathing had gone shallow by then, too fast, irregular. I stepped back and looked up at the sun, squinting against the brightness, then back at the shadow. The angle was impossible, physically impossible. The sun was almost directly overhead, and this shadow was stretching 20 feet across the valley floor like it was still morning. I pulled out my phone, took more pictures, video too. I wanted proof, wanted something that would make sense later when I was back in my apartment trying to convince myself this happened. The camera captured it perfectly. A shadow that shouldn't exist, frozen in time. I don't know how long I stood there. 5 minutes, maybe. 10. I kept waiting for something to happen, for the shadow to move, to disappear, to reveal itself as something explainable. It didn't. It just sat there, cold and heavy and wrong, old. When I finally left, I didn't go back to the blind. I hiked straight to my truck and drove home. The whole way I kept thinking about that cold, the way it felt like the shadow wasn't just blocking light. It was absorbing it, holding it, keeping it trapped in some form I couldn't understand. I checked the photos that night. They all showed the same thing, a shadow, a normal-looking shadow in abnormal circumstances. I deleted most of them. I don't know why. Looking at them made my chest tight. I haven't been back to that spot. I tell myself it's because the owl sighting was a dead end, but that's not why. The thought of seeing that shadow again, of touching that cold glass darkness that has no right to exist, I can't do it. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there. If the sun sets every evening and rises every morning and that shadow stays exactly where it was, 20 feet long, pointing west. Frozen. Waiting. I sold most of my gear last month, told people I was transitioning to urban photography, needed different equipment. Really, I just can't make myself sit still in one spot for hours anymore, watching and waiting. Because now I know some things don't move when they should, and there's no camera setting that explains why. I'm going to tell you this because I need someone else to know it happened, and because maybe, I don't know, maybe someone can explain it to me. I'm a pretty rational person. I work in IT, I troubleshoot problems for a living, and I've hiked the Pacific Northwest for 7 years without incident. So when I tell you what happened on the Olympic coast last month, understand that I've tried to rationalize it. I've tried hard. I planned the traverse for early October, Cape Alava to Rialto Beach, about 20 miles of coastline that's mostly empty once the summer tourists clear out. The forecast looked clean. 3 days, 2 nights, solo. I've done harder routes. I loaded my pack Thursday morning, orange rain jacket, red tent, blue sleeping bag, bright colors, the kind that stand out if search and rescue needs to spot you. That detail matters. You'll see why. The first day was perfect. Overcast but dry, the trail threading through coastal forest before dropping onto the beach. The sound of the surf was constant, almost meditative. I made camp that first night on a stretch of sand backed by driftwood logs, the kind bleached white by years of salt and sun. I remember thinking how everything here gets worn down eventually. The wood, the rocks, even the light felt washed out. But that's the coast. That's normal. I set up the tent and ate a cold dinner, watching the waves in the failing light. The tent looked good against the gray sand, that bright red nylon catching what little light remained. I fell asleep to the rhythm of the ocean and woke the next morning to fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet. That's when I first noticed the jacket. I'd hung it on a piece of driftwood near the tent, and when I went to grab it, I stopped. The orange had faded, not a little, significantly. It looked like I'd left it in direct sun for months, that vivid safety orange bleached to something closer to pale yellow. I stood there holding it, running the fabric through my fingers. The material felt fine, not degraded or worn, just drained. I checked the tag, same jacket. My name was still sharpied on the inside collar from a group trip 2 years back, but the color was wrong. I told myself it was the fog, the diffused light playing tricks. I put it on and started hiking south, staying close to the waterline where the sand was firmest. The fog never lifted. Everything had this muted, washed-out quality, like walking through an overexposed photograph. Even the roar of the surf sounded distant, dampened. Around midday, I stopped to check my position on the map. That's when I saw the tent bag strapped to my pack. The stuff sack that had been deep red, a color I'd specifically chosen so I wouldn't lose it, was now a faded pink, almost coral. I pulled it off and held it up to the gray light. My hands were shaking. I don't know why that detail got to me, but it did. I kept hiking. What else was I going to do? Turn back? I was halfway through the route, committed, but I started noticing other things. My blue sleeping bag, visible through the compression sack's mesh panel, looked pale, washed out. The green of my pack's accents had gone sage gray. Even the bright yellow stuff sack holding my first aid kit looked like old newspaper. By the time I made camp that second night, I wasn't thinking about the hike anymore. I was thinking about the colors, about how everything I'd brought with me was fading, and how none of this made any kind of sense. Salt air doesn't do this. Sun doesn't do this overnight. And there hadn't been any sun. I set up the tent, now a sickly pink that reminded me of raw meat left out too long, and sat on a log staring at my gear spread around me. Everything looked old, used up, like it had been here for years instead of days. The fog pressed in close, and the sound of the waves felt wrong, too regular, too measured, like breathing. That's when I looked at my hands. The skin on my knuckles had a grayish cast. Not dirt. I'd washed them in a stream an hour before. This was something else, something under the skin. The veins on the backs of my hands stood out darker than they should, a bruised purple against skin that looked increasingly pallid, almost translucent. I held them up to what little light remained and watched them shake. I pulled up my sleeve. The gray crept up past my wrists, fading to normal skin tone around mid-forearm. The transition was gradual but undeniable. Where my skin had been exposed to the air, the color was being pulled out of it, leached away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the tent with my headlamp on, checking my hands every few minutes, watching. The gray spread slowly, so slowly I couldn't catch it in the act. But every time I looked, it had advanced a little further. By dawn, it had reached my elbows. My face, when I checked it in the small signal mirror I carry, had the same washed-out quality. My lips looked pale. My eyes seemed too dark in contrast, like they were sinking into my skull. The fog was thicker that morning. I couldn't see the waterline from my tent. I packed up fast, everything now in shades of gray and pink and faded yellow, like old photographs, and started hiking. I didn't care about the route anymore. I just needed to get off the beach, back to the forest, back to somewhere that didn't feel like it was slowly erasing me. But the fog stayed with me. I hiked for 3 hours and the visibility never improved. The sound of the surf never faded, and my skin kept draining, the gray creeping up my arms, across my chest, down my legs. I could feel it in my breathing, in the way my lungs seemed to work harder for less oxygen. Everything felt thin, diluted. I made it to Rialto Beach by early afternoon, stumbling into the parking lot like I'd been lost for days instead of hours. There were a few cars there, a couple with their dog, and when they saw me, they went quiet. The woman took a step back. The man asked if I needed help, but his voice had this edge to it, like he wasn't sure if I was sick or dangerous. I caught my reflection in a car window. My skin was gray, almost uniform now, the color of old driftwood or weathered stone. My gear hung off me in faded, lifeless colors. I looked like something that had been left out in the elements for years, something the coast had finished with. I drove straight to urgent care. The doctor couldn't explain it. My vitals were fine, pulse, blood pressure, oxygen levels all normal. She asked about sun exposure, chemical exposure, allergies, medications. I told her about the hike, and she looked at me like I was confused, like maybe I'd been out there longer than I thought. She took blood for testing and told me to follow up with my primary care physician. The blood work came back normal. Everything came back normal. It's been 4 weeks now. The color came back slowly over the first week, seeping back into my skin like watercolor bleeding into wet paper. My gear stayed faded, though. I threw most of it away because I couldn't stand looking at it. But I kept one thing, the stuff sack from my tent. It sits in my desk drawer at work, that washed-out pink that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I take it out and hold it, running my thumb over the fabric, and I think about how everything on that beach was the same color. The driftwood, the sand, the fog, all of it bleached and pale and neutral. I think about what the doctor said, about how all my tests came normal, like my body hadn't changed at all. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I think about that fog, that constant gray pressing in, and how it felt less like weather and more like something paying attention. Like the coast itself was looking at me, considering me, deciding how much color I was worth keeping. I don't hike anymore. I stay away from the ocean because I'm afraid that next time the color won't come back, that I'll just keep fading until there's nothing left but gray, until I'm as bleached and empty as everything else that washes up on that beach and never leaves. I'm a pretty rational guy, for context. I studied civil engineering because I liked the certainty of numbers, the predictability of concrete and steel. So what happened in that ravine shouldn't have been possible. I was 27, 3 months into an internship with a small firm out of Portland. We'd been contracted to do preliminary site surveys for a dam project, nothing major, just a small retention structure to help manage runoff near some new residential development. The property bordered this steep ravine, all dense Douglas fir and tangled undergrowth, the kind of place that stays dark even at noon. My supervisor, Gary, sent me down there with a transit and measuring tape to take some elevation readings near the bottom. Standard stuff. I'd done it a dozen times before. The hike down took maybe 20 minutes. The slope was steeper than it looked from the road, and I had to half-slide the last 30 feet, grabbing at roots and branches to keep from tumbling. When I reached the bottom, the temperature dropped noticeably. The ravine trapped cold air the way it trapped shadows. There was a smell too. Not rot exactly, but that wet earth smell, thick and organic. I set up the equipment near what looked like a natural spring. Just a small pool, maybe 6 feet across, fed by water seeping through the rocks. The surface was completely black. Not murky, black, like looking into ink. But it was perfectly still, no ripples, no movement at all despite the water trickling in from the rocks above. I was crouched there adjusting the transit when I saw it. My reflection. That sounds stupid, I know. Obviously there'd be a reflection, but this was different. The surface of that pool was like polished glass, and the image looking back at me was so sharp I could see individual eyelashes. That's what made me pause, the clarity of it, and then I noticed the expression. The face in the water was crying, not just tearing up, actively crying, silently, mouth twisted in this expression of absolute grief, the kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere deep and broken. I could see the tears tracking down the cheeks, could see the way the jaw was clenched, the way the eyes were squeezed almost shut. I wasn't crying, I was just kneeling there, staring. I touched my own face. My cheeks were dry. I wasn't making that expression. I wasn't feeling anything except confused, maybe a little cold from being down in that ravine. But the reflection kept crying. Here's the thing. I've dealt with weird water reflections before. Ripples can distort things, make your face look strange. But this water wasn't moving, and the image was too perfect, too detailed to be some trick of light or shadow. I waved my hand. Slowly. The reflection didn't move. It just stayed there, staring back at me with that expression of pure, desperate grief, tears running down its face. My chest went tight. I stood up fast, took 2 steps back from the pool. When I looked again from that angle, I couldn't see into the water anymore, just the tree canopy reflected on the surface. I made myself walk back to the edge, crouched down again. The reflection was waiting. Still crying. Still that same horrible expression, like someone had just told it the worst news imaginable. But now, and this is the part that made my hands start shaking, now the eyes were looking directly at me, not at themselves. At me. I could feel it, the way you feel someone's gaze on you in a crowded room. I did something stupid then. I don't know why. I reached out and touched the water. The surface broke. The reflection shattered into ripples, and I saw my hand in there, distorted by the movement. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. Just a weird reflection. Just my brain making something out of nothing. But the ripples settled fast. Too fast. Within seconds the surface was glassy and still again, and the reflection came back. Same face. Same expression. But now the mouth was moving. I couldn't hear anything, there was no sound coming from the water, but I could see the lips forming words over and over. The same phrase, repeated like a prayer or a warning. I've never been good at reading lips, but this was clear enough. 2 words mouthed desperately by my own face staring up at me from impossible water. Run. Please. I fell backward onto the rocks. The transit toppled over with a crash that echoed through the ravine. I scrambled to my feet, not bothering with the equipment, and started climbing. My hands slipped on wet roots. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there, needed to get back up to the road where the sun was still shining and everything made sense. Halfway up, I made the mistake of looking back. The pool was visible through the trees, that perfect black circle in the ravine floor. And even from 40 feet up the slope, I could see someone crouching at its edge. Someone wearing the same jacket I was wearing, the same jeans. Someone leaning over the water like they were looking for something they'd lost. But I was up here on the slope. I was standing right there, breathing hard, hands muddy from climbing. I didn't stop moving until I reached Gary's truck. He was annoyed about the equipment. I told him I'd slipped, panicked about the transit falling into the water, forgot it when I climbed back up. He believed me. Why wouldn't he? People get spooked in the woods all the time, do stupid things. He sent someone else down the next day to retrieve the gear. The guy who went down said there wasn't any pool, just wet rocks, a little trickle of water running through. Certainly nothing big enough to see your reflection in. I've looked at the survey maps since then, the topographical data we collected. The elevation readings don't make sense in that area. There's a depression that shouldn't exist based on the surrounding geography, like something scooped out a piece of the ravine floor and left everything else untouched. And sometimes, when I'm washing my face in the morning or catching my reflection in a darkened window, I see it again for just a second. That expression, that grief. Like the version of me in that water is still down there, still trying to warn me about something I haven't experienced yet. I've driven trucks for 6 years, fixed them for longer than that. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand I'm not some jumpy kid who spooks at shadows. I know what's normal on a night road. 3 weeks ago, I was bringing a Kenworth logging truck back from our shop to the yard up near the Canadian border. 11 at night, middle of September. The owner needed it for a morning haul, and we'd replace the entire brake system, so I volunteered for the drive. 200 miles, most of it through National Forest on Route 97. Empty roads, good money for overnight work. I should mention the truck was loud. These logging rigs, even empty, they announce themselves. You hear them coming from a quarter mile away. About 40 miles in, I saw the first rabbit. It was sitting maybe 3 feet off the shoulder, caught in my headlights, but it wasn't doing what rabbits do. It wasn't frozen in that panicked way, and it wasn't running. It was facing away from me, completely still, staring into the tree line. I passed close enough to see its ears were up, alert, locked on something in the woods I couldn't see. I remember thinking that was odd. Then I didn't think about it. 10 minutes later, another rabbit. Same position, same posture. Sitting on the shoulder, facing the forest. Not moving as 18 tons of truck and light and noise rolled past 6 feet away. Then a squirrel, frozen halfway up a pine trunk on the road's edge. Not climbing, not fleeing, just gripping the bark, head turned toward the darkness between the trees. I slowed down without meaning to, started watching the shoulder instead of the road. Every animal I passed was doing the same thing. Raccoons sitting upright in the grass, bodies angled toward the woods, a fox standing perfectly still at the tree line, ears forward. None of them acknowledged the truck. Not a glance, not a flinch. They were watching something else, something I couldn't see, with an intensity that made my stomach feel wrong. I don't know how else to explain it, but when prey animals ignore a threat that close, that loud, it means there's a bigger threat they can't afford to look away from. The road curved east and the forest got denser. Older trees, tighter together, the kind of dark that pushes back against headlights. I was doing maybe 30 now, scanning both shoulders. My hands were damp on the wheel. That's when I started seeing deer. The first one was a doe standing in the ditch about 15 feet off the road. Same rigid posture, same unwavering focus on the forest. Her ears were pinned forward so hard they looked painful. I laid on the horn as I passed. She didn't move, didn't even twitch. Didn't. 200 yards later, a buck. Then another doe, then 3 more, scattered along a 100-foot stretch, all of them locked in that same position, staring into the trees like they were waiting for something to step out. Some of them were close enough to the road that my side mirror nearly clipped them. None of them moved. None of them ran. I need you to understand what that means. Deer will bolt if you slam a car door 300 feet away. The sound of this truck should have sent them crashing into the woods long before I got close. But they stayed. Watching. My chest felt tight. I realized I was holding my breath. The animals were getting larger. I saw an elk next. Then 2 more. They were massive, dark shapes at the forest edge, and they had that same eerie stillness. One of them was so close to the shoulder that when my headlights hit it, I could see its eyes. Wide, unblinking, fixed on the tree line. I think that's when I started really understanding something was wrong. Not wrong like mechanical failure or bad weather. Wrong in a way that didn't have a name. I couldn't see anything in the woods. Just darkness pressed between the trunks, thicker than it should be. But every living thing along that road was looking at it like it was the only thing that mattered. The road straightened out for about a mile. I could see headlights ahead, faint, coming toward me. Another vehicle. The first one I'd seen in an hour. I felt a spike of relief so sharp it hurt. But as we got closer, the other truck slowed, then stopped in the middle of the road. Hazards on, just sitting there. I stopped about 50 feet away, put my own flashers on. Driver's door opened and a guy got out, maybe 50. Loggers build, flannel jacket. He walked to the center line and waved both hands over his head. Not frantic, just deliberate. Stop, don't go further. I climbed down from the cab. The night air smelled like pine sap and cold dirt. He met me halfway, and I could see his face in my headlights. Pale. Sweating. "You see them?" he said. His voice was hoarse. "The animals," I said. He nodded, didn't elaborate, didn't need to. "How far does it go?" I asked. "I don't know. I turned around 6 miles up. There's more of them the further north you go, bigger ones." He paused, looked past me down the road. I saw a moose. It was standing in the middle of the road. Didn't move when I got close. Just stood there, staring east into the trees. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The only sound was the diesel idle of our trucks. "What do you think they're looking at?" I said. He shook his head. "I don't want to know." I asked if he had cell service. He said no, same as me. Nearest town was 30 miles south for him, 20 north for me. He said he was heading back, getting off this road. He asked if I was going to keep going. I told him I had to. The yard was only 18 miles up. I'd drop the truck and drive my car back. He looked at me like I'd said something stupid. Maybe I had. But the truck was worth $200,000 and my boss needed it in 5 hours. That was the job. "Don't stop," he said, "whatever you do." Then he got back in his truck and left. I stood there for a minute watching his taillights disappear. The forest felt closer than it had before, heavier. I could hear wind moving through the branches, but it didn't sound right. Too steady, too rhythmic. I got back in the cab and started driving. The animals grew denser. Clusters of them now, grouped along the shoulder every few hundred feet. Deer, elk, even a bear I saw standing on its hind legs at the tree line, front paws hanging limp, head turned toward the woods. I stopped counting after 30, and then I realized something that made my skin go cold. They weren't just facing the woods, they were tracking something. Because every animal I passed was angled slightly more to the left than the last, like whatever they were watching was moving parallel to the road, pacing me. I sped up to 45. The truck's suspension groaned on the uneven pavement. I kept my eyes forward, but I couldn't stop glancing at the tree line. The dark between the trunks looked thicker now, solid almost, like it had depth. Then I saw the moose. It was standing in my lane, 100 feet ahead. Massive, maybe 7 feet at the shoulder, antlers spanning wider than the truck's hood. It didn't move as I approached, just stood there, broadside, staring east. I hit the brakes and the air system hissed. The truck shuddered to a stop 20 feet away. I laid on the horn, long, blaring blasts that echoed off the trees. The moose didn't move. I don't know how long I sat there. 30 seconds, a minute. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I looked past the moose into the woods where it was staring. The darkness moved. Not like something stepping through it. Like the darkness itself shifted, pulled inward. I can't describe it better than that. It wasn't a shape or a shadow. It was an absence, something that didn't belong, and my brain refused to process it as anything solid. But I felt it looking back. The moose stepped sideways, off the road, still facing the forest, still locked on, and I drove past it, and I didn't look into the trees again. I white-knuckled it the last 12 miles, dropped the truck at the yard, got in my car, and drove south until I hit daylight. I'm telling you this because I need someone else to know it happened, even if you don't believe me. I'm Adam Schultz. I'm 41. I catalog old documents for museums and historical societies, and I've driven through the Cascades more times than I can count. I'm not prone to panic or imagination. It was late October, maybe 11 at night, and I was heading back from a job near Darrington. The moon was full that night, bright enough that I'd turned off my high beams on some stretches because I didn't need them. Glacier Peak was somewhere off to my right, this massive, dark shape against the sky. The road was empty. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. I noticed the shadows first because they looked wrong. My truck has a pretty distinctive profile. Toolbox in the bed, ladder rack on top. When the moonlight hit it from the right angle, the shadow it cast on the pavement should have been singular, sharp. Instead, there were two. Identical shadows, running parallel, separated by maybe 6 feet. Both perfectly crisp, both mimicking every bump and turn of the road. I thought it was an optical illusion at first, some trick of the terrain or the angle of the moon. But I watched those shadows for a solid 2 minutes, and they never merged, never wavered. Two distinct silhouettes of my truck, sliding across the asphalt in perfect tandem. I pulled over. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself I was seeing things, that tiredness was playing games with my head. The engine ticked as it cooled. I sat there gripping the wheel, staring at the side mirror. When I opened the door and stepped out, my shadow split. Not metaphorically. I mean, I looked down at the ground and saw two shadows extending from my feet. One stretched toward the road, normal and expected. The other angled slightly left, maybe 10 degrees off, equally dark and defined. I lifted my arm. Both shadows lifted their arms. I turned my head. Both shadows turned their heads, but the second one lagged. Just a fraction of a second. When I moved, the first shadow responded instantly the way shadows do. The second one followed a heartbeat later, like it was receiving the information on a delay. I stood there in the middle of the highway doing this, raising my arms, shifting my weight, watching this delayed twin mimic me with that tiny, impossible gap in timing. My mouth had gone dry. I walked a few steps toward the shoulder and both shadows followed, maintaining their separation. The moonlight was coming from directly overhead, almost perpendicular. There was no secondary light source. No street lights, no other cars, nothing that could explain a second shadow. I crouched down and touched the pavement where the duplicate shadow fell. The asphalt was cold, ordinary. My hand passed through the shadow without resistance, obviously, but I had this absurd hope that I'd feel something. Temperature change, texture, anything, there was nothing. Here's the thing that made my skin go cold. When I looked up at the sky to check the moon, I saw it was singular. One moon. But for just a moment, and I mean a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a second one, a ghostly double overlapping the first. I blinked and it was gone, but the impression stayed burned into my vision. I got back in the truck faster than I should have, considering how badly my hands were shaking. I locked the doors, which was stupid, but I did it anyway. Then I just sat there trying to regulate my breathing, watching the doubled shadow of my truck stretch across the empty road. I should have turned around, driven back to Darrington, found a motel, waited until daylight. But the idea of retracing my route, of passing back through whatever localized strangeness was causing this, felt worse than pushing forward, so I drove. For the next 10 miles, every object I passed cast two shadows. Road signs, mile markers, the occasional boulder near the shoulder. Trees became forests of doubled silhouettes, each one slightly offset from its twin. When my headlights swept across a guardrail, both shadows would bend and twist in unison, but never quite synchronized. I kept my eyes on the road and tried not to look at anything too closely. My speedometer read 70 in a 55 zone. I didn't care. Then I came around a curve and saw the deer. It was standing in the middle of my lane, maybe 60 feet ahead, frozen in my headlights. And it had two shadows, just like everything else. But the deer's second shadow was doing something different. While the animal stood perfectly still, staring at my truck with that blank stare deer have, its duplicate shadow was moving, walking slowly across the pavement, angling toward the shoulder. I watched it separate from the stationary deer, this impossible silhouette traveling independently across the road, while the creature casting it remained motionless. I slammed the brakes. The truck fishtailed slightly, tires screaming, and the deer bolted. Both the animal and its shadows vanishing into the trees in different directions. I sat there in the middle of the highway, engine running, hands welded to the wheel. My breath was coming too fast. That sound my own breathing amplified in the cab's silence is what finally scared me into moving again. The doubled shadows persisted for another 7 miles. Then, as I started descending toward lower elevation, they began to fade. Not all at once. It happened gradually, the secondary shadows growing paler and less defined until they were just suggestions, then gone entirely. By the time I reached the outskirts of Granite Falls, everything looked normal. 1 shadow per object, 1 moon in the sky. My truck's silhouette on the pavement was singular and behaving exactly as physics dictated. I pulled into a gas station and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, lights off, just breathing. A couple other cars came and went, normal people doing normal things, pumping gas, buying coffee, living in a world where light behaved predictably. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no alerts. The news sites showed nothing unusual happening in the area. No seismic activity, no atmospheric anomalies, no reports of strange phenomena, just a regular October night in Washington. When I got home around 2 in the morning, I stood in my driveway under the porch light and checked my shadow. One shadow, normal and singular and properly aligned with the light source. I haven't driven through that pass since. I've had 3 jobs up in that area since October, and I've turned them all down, made excuses. I don't know what I experienced or what it means. I don't know if it was localized to that specific night, that specific stretch of road, or if it's still happening up there. What I do know is this. Sometimes when the moon is full and bright, I catch myself checking my shadow more than once, making sure there's only one of them, making sure it's moving when I move, stopping when I stop, with no delay. My name's Henry Miller. Everyone calls me Hank, and I'm 47 years old. I logged timber for 23 years before my back gave out, and after the settlement I bought a cabin up in the Cascade foothills, remote enough that my nearest neighbor's about 4 miles down a logging road that washes out every spring. I'm not someone who spooks easy, for context. You don't spend 2 decades working in old-growth forest, watching trees that could kill you in 100 different ways, without developing a pretty solid sense of what's dangerous and what's just your imagination working overtime. The cabin's in a valley, narrow thing, maybe 3 miles long and half a mile across at its widest point. Ridgelines on both sides, pretty steep, thick with Douglas fir and hemlock. I moved in last October, and for the first few months everything was exactly what I'd paid for. Quiet, isolated, the kind of place where you can hear the weather coming from miles away. The fog started in late February, not unusual for the area. We get plenty of fog rolling through these valleys, especially in the morning, but this fog came in the afternoons, always between 2 and 2:30. I noticed because I'd started keeping a pretty regular schedule, and the light change was always right when I'd be splitting wood for the evening fire. At first, I thought it was just me imposing patterns where there weren't any. You live alone long enough, you start seeing connections in things that are probably just coincidence. But after about a week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The fog rolled in at almost exactly the same time every day, and it settled into the valley floor like water finding its level. That's when I started noticing the edges. I was up on the ridge one afternoon checking some deadfall I'd been meaning to clear when the fog came in below me. From that angle, looking down into the valley, I could see the whole thing at once. And the fog, it had a border, not a gradual thinning like normal fog where it gets wispy and eventually fades into clear air. This was a line, sharp enough that I could see exactly where it ended. The fog filled the valley floor from the southern end up to about 2/3 of the way through, stopping at this outcropping of basalt that juts out from the eastern ridge. It never went past that point, and along the sides it came right up to the slope and just stopped, like someone had poured it into a mold. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, watching. The fog didn't move the way fog should move. It didn't drift or curl or thin out in places. It sat there, dense and uniform, with those impossible edges holding firm even when the wind picked up enough to bend the treetops. I know what you're thinking: atmospheric conditions, temperature inversions, some kind of geographic quirk that creates unusual weather patterns. I thought the same thing. I spent 3 days researching online, reading about valley fog and marine layers and temperature gradients. None of it explained what I was seeing. Temperature inversions create fog that pools in low areas, sure, but it doesn't create geometric boundaries. It doesn't respect invisible lines drawn across the landscape. The next week, I started mapping it. I took a topographic chart of the valley and marked exactly where the fog ended each day. Same boundaries, every single time. The southern terminus was always at this cluster of 3 big cedars near the valley entrance. The northern edge always stopped at the basalt outcrop. The eastern and western edges followed the base of the slopes, but not the actual base. They stopped about 40 feet up from the valley floor, at this consistent elevation that had nothing to do with any geographic feature I could identify. Here's the thing that got under my skin. I could walk into it. I'd be standing in clear air, and I could see this wall of fog 10 feet in front of me, and I could just step through. Inside, the visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, everything gray and muffled. But when I looked back, there was the edge, sharp as a knife cut, and I could see the clear valley beyond it. It felt like walking through a door. By the third week, I started having this thought I couldn't shake, that I was looking at a boundary, not a weather pattern, a perimeter, something marking off a specific area with specific dimensions for a specific purpose. I tried talking to my neighbor, a guy named Curtis, who'd lived out here for 30 years. Drove down to his place one morning and asked him, casual as I could manage, if he'd noticed anything weird about the fog lately. He looked at me like I'd asked him if the trees were watching us. Said it was just valley fog, same as always. When I pressed him, asked if he'd seen how precise the boundaries were, he got this expression I couldn't quite read. Not confused. More like uncomfortable. Told me he doesn't pay much attention to the weather anymore, that when you've lived in the mountains as long as he has, you learn to just let it be what it is. I started losing sleep. Not from nightmares or anything like that, just lying awake, thinking about those edges, thinking about what it would take to create something like that, the level of control you'd need, the precision. Last week I drove up to the basalt outcrop right before the fog was due. I wanted to see it happen up close, see if I could catch the formation, understand how something like that begins. I parked the truck and waited, sitting on the hood with a clear view down the valley. 2:17 in the afternoon, I felt the temperature drop. Not gradually, it was like someone flipped a switch. Then the fog appeared. Not rolled in. Appeared. One moment I was looking at clear air over the valley floor, and the next there was fog, fully formed, filling the space from the southern end and flowing forward. Except flowing isn't the right word, because there was no progression. It advanced like a wall, this vertical curtain moving up the valley at a steady pace, maybe 20 miles per hour, until it reached the outcrop and stopped dead. I was looking right at it. The edge of the fog was maybe 10 feet from where I stood, and I could see individual trees on the other side, completely clear, while the valley behind the fog line was completely obscured. The boundary was so sharp I could have measured it with a ruler. I did something stupid then. I walked up to the edge and stuck my hand through. The fog was cold. Not the damp chill of normal fog, but a dry cold that made my skin prickle. I pulled my hand back and the moisture that should have been there wasn't. My skin was completely dry. That's when I noticed the silence. Inside the fog, I couldn't hear anything. Not birds, not wind, not the distant sound of the creek that runs through the southern end of the valley. I stood right at that boundary and the difference was absolute. Normal forest sounds on one side, total silence on the other. Got back in my truck and drove home. Didn't stop at the cabin. Kept driving down the logging road to the highway, found a motel in Enumclaw, and spent 2 nights there trying to convince myself I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen. But I came back. Where else was I going to go? This is my home, my cabin, my land, my retirement plan. And the fog keeps coming every afternoon, same time, same boundaries, same impossible precision. I'm sitting on my porch right now. It's 2:40. The fog's been in place for about 20 minutes, and I'm looking at that eastern edge where it stops at the base of the slope. There's a hemlock tree right at the boundary line, half in the fog and half out of it, and I can see both halves at the same time. The fog doesn't thin around the trunk, doesn't curl or dissipate. It just cuts straight through, bisecting the tree like it isn't even there. I keep thinking about what Curtis said, that when you've lived in the mountains long enough, you learn to let it be what it is. Like he knows something he's decided not to think about anymore. Like maybe I'm not the first person to notice, just the first person who won't let it go. The fog lifts around 6:30 every evening, same precision. One moment it's there, the next it's gone, evaporating upward in this uniform layer that disappears all at once. And I'm left standing in my valley, looking at the ridgelines, wondering what I'm inside of. It was mid-February, and I'd volunteered to do maintenance on one of our repeater antennas. The tower sits at about 7,000 feet, accessible only by snowmobile, and someone needed to swap out a failing battery before the next storm cycle made the site unreachable for weeks. I'm single, no kids, and I've done solo winter maintenance runs dozens of times. It's actually peaceful up there when the weather's stable. Except the weather wasn't stable. The forecast had called for light snow, maybe 3 inches. What I got instead was a full whiteout that rolled in 2 hours after I reached the tower. By the time I'd finished the battery swap, visibility was down to maybe 15 feet, and the wind was hitting 40 miles per hour. I made the call to shelter in the maintenance shed rather than risk the ride down in those conditions. The shed's small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a propane heater, a cot, and a workbench with our backup radio equipment. Standard protocol is to check in every 2 hours during a shelter situation. So I powered up the radio and did my first check-in at 4 in the afternoon. Clear signal, no problems. My coordinator confirmed the storm was supposed to break by morning. I settled in with a book and some instant coffee. The wind was screaming outside, but the shed was well built and the heater kept it comfortable. Around 6 in the evening, I did my second check-in. That's when I first heard it. Just as I was signing off, there was this sound underneath the static, high-pitched, delicate, like a music box, but not quite. The notes were too pure, too crystalline. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then disappeared back into the white noise. I actually pulled the headset away from my ear and looked at it, confused. Our radios are old Motorola units built for durability, not music reproduction. The idea that one would somehow play a melody was absurd. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe I'd picked up some weird interference from a distant station. Maybe the storm was doing something strange to the signal propagation. I went back to my book, but I couldn't concentrate. The sound had been so clear, so deliberate. 20 minutes later, it happened again. Same chiming melody, same crystalline quality, but this time it lasted longer, maybe 8 seconds. And it was louder. I grabbed the radio and started scanning frequencies manually, trying to isolate where it was coming from. The problem was, it seemed to be coming from everywhere. Every frequency I checked had that same underlying chime, like it was bleeding through from somewhere else entirely. Here's the thing. I've worked with radios my entire adult life. I understand how they function, how signals propagate, how interference works. What I was hearing violated every principle I knew. The music box sound wasn't being broadcast. It was being generated somehow, assembled from the ambient RF noise, like the radio was translating something it shouldn't be able to detect. By 7 in the evening, the chiming was constant. I couldn't escape it. Even with the radio powered down, I swear I could still hear it, faint and persistent, like it had embedded itself in my skull. My hands were shaking as I powered the unit back on. I needed to understand what I was hearing. I spent the next hour trying every technical solution I could think of. I checked all the connections, swapped out cables, even hauled out our backup radio unit to see if it was a hardware fault. Both radios produced the exact same sound, same frequency, same melody, same impossible clarity. And then around 8:15 I heard the scream. It was buried underneath the chiming, so perfectly layered that at first I thought it was just another harmonic. But as I adjusted the squelch and fine-tuned the frequency, it became unmistakable. A woman's voice, caught in a loop of pure terror. Not words, just a single sustained scream that rose and fell in perfect synchronization with the music box melody. The scream would build to a peak, then cut off abruptly, then start again from the beginning, over and over, mechanical in its precision, I sat there with the headset pressed against my ear, barely breathing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The scream wasn't old or degraded like a recording would be. It sounded immediate, present, like whoever was screaming was doing it right now in real time, somewhere close. I did something then that I'm not proud of. I tried to respond. I keyed the mic and identified myself, asked if anyone could hear me, if anyone needed help. My voice sounded small and hollow through the speaker. The only response was that same looped scream, that same crystalline chiming, perfectly overlaid and unending. The storm was still raging outside, but I found myself putting on my jacket, getting ready to go out there, because some primitive part of my brain was convinced that if I could just find the source, if I could just locate whoever was screaming, I could help them. I actually had my hand on the door handle before I stopped myself. There was no one out there. There couldn't be. The nearest road was 12 miles away through impassable terrain, and even if someone had somehow made it up here, they wouldn't be broadcasting on our frequency, and they definitely wouldn't sound like that. Like their terror had been refined into something pure and terrible and endlessly repeating. I forced myself to sit back down. I turned off both radios and sat in the silence, listening to my own breathing, the wind outside, the hiss of the propane heater, trying to convince myself that I'd just experienced some weird atmospheric phenomenon, some quirk of electromagnetic propagation that I didn't understand. But I could still hear it, faint, almost subliminal, like it was coming from inside the walls, or inside me. Around 10 at night, my coordinator called for a scheduled check-in. I used the backup radio, kept the conversation brief. Yes, I was fine. Yes, I had enough supplies. Yes, I'd ride down as soon as the weather broke. I didn't mention what I'd heard. What would I even say? The chiming continued all night. I didn't sleep. I sat on that cot with my back against the wall, watching the radio equipment, waiting for it to do something. Around 3 in the morning, the sound changed. The music box melody was still there, but underneath it, beneath even the screaming, I could hear something else. A rustling, scratching sound like movement through snow. And breathing. Heavy, labored, getting closer. I'm not an imaginative person. I don't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. But in that moment, I was absolutely convinced that something was outside the shed, circling it, using the storm as cover. The radios were still powered down, but the sound was coming through anyway, clearer than ever, like whatever was out there was broadcasting directly into my nervous system. The storm broke at dawn. I packed my gear with numb fingers, started the snowmobile, and got the hell off that mountain. I didn't look back. I didn't file a report about what I'd heard. When my coordinator asked how the shelter went, I said it was fine, uneventful, just another storm. I resigned from search and rescue 2 weeks later, told everyone I was burning out, needed a change. The truth is, I can't go back up there. Because the last thing I heard before I left that shed, the last thing that came through those dead radios wasn't the chiming or the screaming. It was my own voice calling for help, perfectly looped and layered beneath sounds that shouldn't exist. And I never keyed the mic. My name is Greg Wilson. I'm 44, retired Army after 22 years, and I work contract security now. Nothing exciting, just corporate campuses and event gigs. Last September, a company called Tactics Solutions reached out about field testing their new modular survival system. They wanted someone with actual wilderness experience to take their kit into a challenging environment for a week. The pay was decent, and honestly, I missed being out in real country. I said yes. They sent me the kit 3 weeks before the trip. Everything vacuum sealed, inventoried with photos and serial numbers, top shelf gear, magnesium fire starter, water purification tablets, emergency radio, multi-tool, first aid supplies, reflective blanket, the works. I checked every item against their manifest twice, photographed everything myself. Old habit. I drove out to the channeled scablands in eastern Washington the first week of September. High desert, basalt formations, minimal cell coverage. I wasn't going deep backcountry. I had waypoints marked, check-in coordinates. This was supposed to be controlled. Professional. The first 2 days were textbook. Temperatures in the low 90s during the day, dropping to the 40s at night. I rationed water, tested the purification tabs on a seasonal creek, made camp in the shadow of a columnar basalt ridge. The kit performed exactly as expected. On the third morning, I went to start a fire for coffee. I pulled out the magnesium fire starter. Same black rubberized grip, same lanyard I'd tied myself. But when I went to scrape it, the striker just crumbled. Soft, powdery. I looked closer. The entire magnesium block was chalk. Not similar to chalk. Actual classroom chalk, shaped and painted to look like magnesium. The weight was wrong. The texture was wrong. But the grip, the lanyard, the scuff marks I'd made during my test run at home, all identical. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just turning it over in my hands. Then I opened the main pack and started checking everything else. The water purification tablets were fine. The first aid kit was fine. The multi-tool was fine. I told myself it was a manufacturing defect, some bizarre quality control failure. I documented in my report. That night I tried the radio. It was past my second check-in window. I powered it on. LED indicators lit up correctly. Static came through the speaker. But when I transmitted, nothing. I checked the battery. Full charge. I opened the casing. Inside was a carved piece of wood, painted black plastic over balsa or pine, I don't know. Someone had shaped it to fit perfectly in the radio housing, added weight with what felt like sand or pellets glued to the bottom. The buttons were painted on. The speaker was real. There was an actual speaker component, but it wasn't connected to anything. The static I'd heard was coming from a small loop of wire that picked up atmospheric interference. The LED lights worked because they were wired to the battery, but there was no transmitter, no circuit board, just wood and paint and enough functional details to pass a casual inspection. The serial number on the outside matched my inventory photo. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the first aid kit next to me, checking it every hour with my flashlight. Gauze, antiseptic, trauma shears, Israeli bandage, all real, all correct. By morning, the trauma shears were stamped tin. They looked right. They had the same orange handles, but the blades wouldn't cut. They bent when I pressed them against fabric. Here's the thing. I never heard anything. No footsteps, no tent disturbance. I'm a light sleeper. I spent 2 tours in Kandahar where light sleeping kept you alive. Nothing got into that tent. I packed up and started hiking back to my vehicle. 12 miles, mostly easy terrain. I had enough water for the trip if I was careful. The purification tablets were still good. I'd checked them that morning, dissolved one in a bottle. It fizzed, smelled like chlorine. Real. Around noon, I stopped to refill my bottles at a runoff pool. I dropped in a tablet. It fizzed. But the water didn't taste right. It didn't taste like anything. I spat it out and looked at the tablet container. They looked perfect. But when I crushed one between my fingers, it was compressed flour, maybe plaster, detailed enough to fool me in the bottle, but completely inert. I dumped my pack and went through everything. The reflective blanket was mylar on one side, but the other side was aluminum foil glued to tissue paper. The compass worked until I looked closely and realized the needle was just painted on rotating plastic. It didn't point north, it swung randomly. The paracord was cotton twine wrapped in a synthetic sheath. The duct tape was masking tape with a glossy coating. The food was still food. The water bottles were still water bottles, but everything designed to keep me alive, everything I'd need in an emergency, had been systematically replaced. I made it back to the truck before dark. I didn't stop moving, didn't make camp. When I got home, I contacted Tactic Solutions. They had no record of sending me a kit, no record of hiring me. The email address I'd been corresponding with didn't exist. The payment had come from a terminated account, flagged for reversal. I still had the money, but the source was gone. I kept the fake gear in my garage for 2 weeks. Then I started noticing other things. The spare key I kept in my desk drawer, same key ring, same brass color, but the teeth were filed wrong. It looked identical but didn't fit my locks. A medication bottle in my bathroom cabinet, same label, same pills, but when I checked with my pharmacy, they had no record of that refill. The pills were acetaminophen pressed and dyed to look like my prescription. I don't know what I tested. I don't know what was watching me out there, learning what I needed so it could take it away. I don't know if it followed me home. Last week, I found a photograph in my wallet that I don't remember taking. It's me, asleep in my tent that 4th night. The angle is from above. There's nothing else in the frame. Just me, and the gear laid out beside me that hadn't been replaced yet. I burned it, but now I can't remember if the lighter I used was real. My name's Ben Carter, and I'm a nature artist. Or I was trying to be one anyway. I'm 30, I live in Boise, and up until 2 weeks ago, I thought the worst thing that could happen on a camping trip was maybe a bear getting into your food. I'd driven out to this secluded spot near the Idaho-Montana border, about 8 miles from the nearest trail marker, looking for inspiration. The kind of place where the light filters through old-growth pine in a way that makes you understand why people paint landscapes. I have synesthesia. Had it my whole life. Not the famous kind where you see music as colors. Mine's weirder. Smells have textures to me, and colors have scents. The red of a stoplight smells faintly metallic. Deep forest green has this rich, loamy scent, even when I'm looking at it on a screen. It's not overwhelming or anything. It's just always been there. This extra layer of sensory information that most people don't get. As an artist, it's actually been useful. I can paint a sunset and know instinctively when the orange is right because it should smell like warm honey. The morning it started, I woke up around 6. I always make coffee first thing. This ritual I have with a little camping percolator. I went through the motions, filtered water from my canteen, measured grounds, set it on my portable burner. I watched the steam rise, watched the dark liquid bubble up through the glass knob on top. But I couldn't smell it. I brought the cup right up to my face. Nothing. I poured some on my hand. It was hot, definitely coffee. I could feel the heat and see the dark brown stain on my palm. I tasted it. Bitter, strong, exactly like it should be, but the smell was just gone. Not faint, not muted, completely absent. I figured it was a cold coming on. Congestion, maybe. I felt my sinuses. They were clear. I could still breathe fine through my nose. I crouched down and put my face close to the moss growing on the log near my tent. I could smell that, the damp, earthy richness of it, so my nose was working. That's when I looked at my tent. It was red. This bright, almost aggressive red that I'd specifically chosen because I liked how it smelled, like cinnamon and iron, warm and sharp. But now, looking at it in the morning light, there was nothing. The color was there. My eyes were processing it fine. But that other sense, that synesthetic layer, had gone completely silent. I spent the next hour testing everything I could think of. The green pine needles, no smell association. The blue of the sky through the canopy, nothing. But weirdly, if I wasn't looking directly at something, if I just smelled it naturally, everything seemed normal. The coffee in my cup smelled fine when I wasn't looking at it. The forest smelled like a forest should. It was only when I tried to connect the visual to the olfactory that I hit this void. Look, I know how neurological stuff works. I'd read about synesthesia when I was younger, trying to understand what was happening in my brain. I knew it was just cross-wiring, unusual neural pathways, but it had been constant for 30 years. Having it suddenly cut off felt like losing a limb. The world looked flat, hollow. By afternoon, it had gotten worse. I was sketching a patch of wildflowers, these small purple blooms growing in a shaft of sunlight. I'd drawn maybe 3 petals when I realized I couldn't feel the texture of the purple anymore. Not the smell texture from my synesthesia. I mean, I couldn't feel the actual texture of the flower when I touched it. The petals felt like nothing, like touching a projection or a photograph. Visual information with no tactile feedback. I pressed harder, felt the stem bend, watched it flex in my fingers, but there was no sensation. I could see my fingerprints compressing the green surface, but I couldn't feel it happening. My hands started shaking then. I dropped the pencil and just stared at my fingers. They looked normal. I pressed them against the ground, against the bark of a tree, against my own face. I could feel my face fine. I could feel the ground and the bark, but anything that was brightly colored, the green moss, the purple flowers, the red tent, it was like touching air. The sun was starting to set when I noticed the sound issue. I was making dinner, this freeze-dried thing that you add boiling water to. I was stirring it, watching the spoon move through the rehydrated beef and vegetables, and I realized I couldn't hear the spoon scraping the bottom of the container. I could hear the burner hissing. I could hear wind in the trees. But the specific sound of metal on plastic, gone. I tapped the spoon against the container's rim. Nothing. I dropped it. It bounced off the ground and I watched it tumble through the dirt, completely silent. I need to be clear about something here. I wasn't hearing silence like I'd gone deaf. All the ambient noise was still there. The forest sounds, my own breathing, the pop and snap of the burner flame. But specific sounds, the ones that should have come from objects I was directly interacting with, had been erased. By the time it got dark, I couldn't feel temperature anymore. Not body temperature. I could tell I was warm or cold generally, but I couldn't feel the heat of the fire I'd built. I held my hand 6 inches from the flames and felt nothing. I could see the distortion of the air, see the orange light playing across my skin, but there was no warmth. I moved my hand closer, closer, until my fingers were almost touching the burning wood. Nothing. I pulled back fast anyway, because some part of my brain was screaming that this was wrong, that I should be in pain. but there was no sensation at all. I don't know how else to explain it, but it felt like the world was being stripped down to its most basic components, like reality was being reduced to pure visual information, shapes and colors and light, with everything else, all the sensory data that makes things feel real and present and solid, being methodically removed. I tried to sleep that night but couldn't. I lay in my sleeping bag, which I could see but not feel, which had no weight or warmth or texture, and stared up at the tent ceiling, the red fabric that I could no longer smell or associate with anything. I thought about packing up and hiking out, but it was a 3-hour walk back to my truck in the dark, and honestly, I wasn't sure I trusted my body anymore. If I couldn't feel texture or temperature, what else was failing? When dawn came, the colors themselves started going, not fading, disconnecting. I looked at the orange sunrise through the tent mesh and saw the color, but it had no meaning, no association. Orange as a concept felt arbitrary. I looked at my hands and saw the pink tan of my skin, but the color didn't register as flesh. It was just a shade, a wavelength. My brain was still processing the visual information, but it wasn't interpreting it as anything real. I made myself pack up, moved through it mechanically, rolling the sleeping bag I couldn't feel, collapsing the tent that had no smell or texture or weight, loading everything into my backpack. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip the compartments. When I finally started walking, each step felt like I was moving through a video game render, a wireframe approximation of a forest. The hike back took 5 hours, maybe 6. Time felt strange. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, following the trail markers, even though they looked like arbitrary symbols painted on trees that might not be real. When I finally reached my truck, I stood there for a long time just looking at it. Forest green paint, Idaho plates, camping gear visible through the rear window. All of it was there, visually intact. I reached out to touch the door handle and felt nothing. I've been back in Boise for 10 days now. The disconnection is permanent. I can navigate the world fine. I've learned to trust visual cues even when they feel meaningless, to remember that the stove is hot even though I can't feel heat, to eat food that has no taste or texture. People can't tell anything's wrong. I look normal. I sound normal. But everything is flat now, empty, just light and shadow and shape, signifying nothing. The worst part is I still dream normally. Every night I dream and everything has depth again. I can smell and taste and feel. Colors mean something, sounds have weight. Then I wake up and have to remember that none of it's real anymore, that somewhere in those woods I crossed a threshold and whatever makes the world solid and present and meaningful just stopped including me.